Thank you. Thank you. It's an honour to be invited by Professor Alan Hayes and to be with you today. We gather today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And when Auntie Di Kerr welcomed us yesterday, she spoke about the number of children in state care today being higher than during the time of the stolen generations. So my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of this land, to their elders past and present, and to other Indigenous people with us in this room today is not perfunctory. There are many harms to which children in Australia are exposed today. Many of us in this room would be concerned about children growing up in poverty, the children of asylum seekers being held in detention, children being bullied at school, and in some communities, children being poisoned by lead. The harms to which I will be exploring and thinking about where we might go are much closer to home. But I want to take those other harms with us in our heads and hearts. I want to focus on the packaged nature of the problems in many families, in many troubled families, and to talk about prevention as well as amelioration. Child abuse and neglect is not new. It's known across cultures and across time. But in Western society, it was in the 19th century that a societal response emerged in relation to this issue. Here's Inspector Noble, not a police officer. He's an employee of the Victorian Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, established in 1897, and next to him is a little boy called Leslie, found foraging for food on a rubbish dump in Hawthorn, an eastern suburb of this city. This was the time of the first child cruelty legislation, but long before that, children had been in institutional care in this country. Child cruelty was the language used by the child savers, as they called themselves, in the child rescue movement around physical abuse, but they also knew about sexual abuse, and most of the children they encountered suffered neglect and destitution, which is why most of those children were in state care or largely in the care of churches. The state was a most reluctant guardian. In an era of laissez-faire ideology, it was not seen as the role of the state to intrude and violate the family. By the mid-20th century, it was very different. There was a welfare net, a safety net that prevented the type of destitution that had occurred in the greatest economic depression in this nation in the 1890s. We saw the beginning of deinstitutionalisation by those large churches. We saw the discovery, but in fact the rediscovery, of child physical abuse using radiological surveys so that previously undetected fractures in young children became evident. And then in the wake of second wave feminism by the 1980s, child sexual abuse. And we saw a massive growth in the role of the state, not just as guardian, but as the investigator of children who might be at risk. A very broad and vague notion, which has, and as time has gone on, the breadth of issues around which we think children might be at risk has grown and grown. This is, in fact, where I, as a 15-year-old volunteer, worked at the Allambie Reception Centre, to which all children in this state were brought by women police before their cases were heard in the Children's Court. It was witnessing the trauma of those children, which I still find very difficult to speak about in public, which led to me doing what I could in my life to prevent children being abused and neglected, to prevent them coming into the care of the state. We know a lot more than we knew then. Yet, this is true of today as it was a decade ago. That maltreatment is one of the biggest paediatric public health challenges, yet any research activity is dwarfed by work on more established childhood ills. We know a lot more about prevalence, about incidence, and about etiology, but we know very little yet about prevention but that is beginning to change. We have a framework of values to guide us, which we once did not have. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which enshrines the child's right to provision in terms of basic necessities of life, protection from exploitation and abuse, and participation. Participation in decisions affecting them, but as I will argue, participation that goes beyond that. From an historical perspective, there have been two grand ideas, two inspiring ideas, unfolding and gathering momentum over a century. One is the notion of the child as a holder of human rights. The other is the notion of the child as an emotional being. And it's recognising the child as an emotional being and the psychological harm which might be sustained by a broad range of situations that were once not deemed child abuse. The use of harsh physical discipline, or once not deemed neglect, young children left in the care of an older child. These two grand ideas have paradoxically brought our statutory child protection systems to breaking point. We need to keep the ideas. We need to change our systems. We need to change because of these three factors, because child maltreatment has high prevalence and high incidence, number of reported cases, because it causes intense suffering and serious long-term effects. And I want to put the emphasis as much on the suffering, for children are not just becomings, they are beings, and they are hurt today, not just affected tomorrow. And thirdly, because child protection systems are overwhelmed and in some contexts have the capacity to do harm. And I say that with the greatest respect and admiration for the heroes and heroines who work at the coalface of our statutory child protection services. What do we know? Well, using AFE's work that's pulled together prevalence estimates, these are deeply concerning statistics. The child physical abuse and the penetrative child sexual abuse prevalence estimates come from adults telling us about their childhood experiences. And the last figure, with a very broad range between 12 and 23% of children witnessing family violence, come from adults telling us about what happens in their households and what is witnessed by children. Our incidence data is also deeply concerning. Released last week by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, we have learned that there were 53,666 substantiated cases involving over 40,000 children, which was a 29% increase in 2 years. That's an unsustainable pressure on our systems. And that the primary abuse type, because often these travel together, were in that order. That should not be taken, of course, as a reflection of the prevalence in the community. This is incidence data, not prevalence data. And we know that the long-term effects can be devastating. And while we spend a lot of attention, particularly in the media, on acts of commission, physical abuse and sexual abuse, I want to emphasise the impact of severe neglect and being traumatised by witnessing family violence in relation to the most devastating impacts, particularly on early brain development. We have now powerful US research, largely, on the long-term outcomes for adult physical health and mental health, and, of course, increased substance misuse risks, and last but not least, and tragically, the risk of intergenerational child abuse and neglect. So using the large study on adverse childhood events or adverse childhood experiences brought together here by Felitti and Anda, these are the types of experiences that often travel together, of which child abuse and neglect is a significant part. And when you look at the correlation between those experiences and, for example, oh dear, what happened to that? It was there. What that shows is the level of reported alcoholism from those exposed to one or more of those childhood experiences. Pins backwards and then go forwards, and it's still not there. But what it does show is that going from being exposed to one of those adverse childhood events to being exposed to 4 involves an 8-fold increase in reported alcoholism. The situation which you almost don't get to see there. There we go. No, you don't see it. With attempted suicide, if you go from 1 risk factor to 4 risk factors, there's an 18-fold increase in attempted suicide. So that gives you a picture of the synergistic effect or the multiplier effect, and some of you will recognise that from other areas, particularly the work of Michael Rutter in relation to children's exposure to these sorts of events and experiences and the risk of childhood mental health disorders. That leaves Felitti and Ander to conclude that these findings provide a credible basis for a new paradigm of medical, public health and social services practice. Many of our most intractable public health problems are the result of compensatory behaviours such as smoking, overeating and alcohol and drug use, which provide partial relief from the emotional problems caused by traumatic childhood experiences. Our systems are overwhelmed. This is extraordinary and little known data, that by age 18, 1 in 4.2 children in Queensland, 1 in 1.6 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are known to child protection, have been reported to child protection. In New South Wales, 1 in 3 by the age of 16. The projection in Victoria, the other data is not based on projection, but what's actually happened in Victoria, that 1 in 4 children born in 2011 will be notified to the Child Protection Service by the time they end adolescence. There is no child protection system in the world that can respond to demand pressures of that magnitude. This is the result of policies driven by the mantra, identify and notify. This is what the picture is of children in out-of-home care just on one day each year, June 30. If we were to be able to look at the number of children in care on any one given year, it would be much greater. In a decade, the number of children in out-of-home care has doubled. Now over 40,000 children in state care on June 30, 2013, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children over 10 times overrepresented in that population. Because we are bringing more children into care each year than are leaving care, but the major drivers are children coming into care at a much younger age and staying in care longer. Is there a capacity for our systems to do further harm? Well, it's with some ambivalence that I share this research, because there are issues of generalisability from the 1980s, from Illinois. I don't want to stretch it beyond school-age children. And remember, this was about children on the margins of placement, so it can't necessarily be extrapolated to systems which remove relatively few children. But this massive data linkage study by Doyle has been very confronting, and we don't have evidence yet in Australia to be able to speak about this. But it leads me to be deeply concerned when we know from this that school-age children on the margin of placement who remained at home had lower adult arrest rates, lower teenage pregnancy rates, and better employment than those placed in care. Why might coming into care be harmful? It's not predominantly because of abuse in care in the form of physical or sexual abuse, again, that which we focus on in the media. It's because of placement instability. This is the most recent data. I've no reason to believe that it's different in other jurisdictions, but the Carmody inquiry in Queensland identified this trend, increasing placement instability. I want you not to look at these as statistics. I would like you to close your eyes for a moment and think of a child you know and love. I want you to think about what 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 placements would do to that child. How it would corrode that child to the very core of their being. Their capacity to trust, their capacity to love, their capacity to be loved, the essence of the humanity. And this is what we do every single day. Every day, today, there will be dozens and dozens, perhaps far more, hundreds perhaps, children who go through a change in their placement. We need to do all we can to prevent children coming into care. We need to do all we can to return children safely to their families after being in care. Where that's not possible, we need to ensure a permanent arrangement, ideally within the child's extended family, but if not, a permanent family environment beyond the extended family. It's because of this impact of placement instability, irrespective of the level of attachment disorders and behavioural problems that children enter care, that lead me to think that we are doing great harm. The whole history of child welfare is paved with progress, but also paved with the pain of children and parents, the stolen generations, the forgotten Australians, the British child migrants, the forced adoption policies. Why is it always a generation later that we begin to hear of that? What I'm inviting you to do is to think that it may be that our policies and practices today may be doing this. And placement instability is one of the greatest harms. So where do we go with those harms? Where is the hope? The first step is to believe that change is possible. 2 weeks ago, I picked up a newspaper and I read this very close to the front page by a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I rarely see easy cases anymore. It's actually hard to intervene effectively because you can't change genetics. You can't change poverty. Child abuse is hard to change and school pressures aren't going away. I understand why people in clinical services believe they can't change child abuse and neglect, why they can't change poverty. But we can change poverty. I'm sure Brian Howe, Brian's somewhere with us today, when he was Minister for Social Security, didn't for a moment believe that you can't change poverty. Well, Nobel laureate and former chief economist of the World Bank, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, says this about social inequality. Inequality is not a fact of nature. It's a consequence of the policies we put in place. It's as simple and as politically complex as that. If we adopt an external locus of control in relation to poverty, in relation to child abuse and neglect, we will not change it. We can change it. Secondly, we need to have a shared understanding of what the problem is. The challenge of ending child abuse is the challenge of breaking the link between adults' problems and children's pain. This is some of the adults' problems: parental substance misuse, domestic violence, mental health problems. This was presented at the last day's conference by Professor Paul Del Fabro, and they often travel together, obviously, because they sum more than 100%. It's these packaged problems of parents that are causing children's pain. But these are not just personal problems. These problems occur mostly, but certainly not always, in a context of economic and social disadvantage. And in the context of growing social inequality, we need to tackle that. The hard data on that in the inquiry that Justice Philip Cummins, Mr Bill Scales and I did in this state in 2011, we found a strong correlation between local government areas with high levels of social disadvantage and high levels of child protection reports and substantiated cases, and a high correlation between both of those and the number of children identified as vulnerable in one or more domains of the Australian Early Development Index. These things travel together, and recent UK research echoes that. We have a service system that can't respond to that complexity. We have a service system largely organised around single input services based on categorical funding, so that families with multiple and complex needs often end up involved with a large number of organisations in a revolving door, often with what I call referral reflex, a lot of throughput going on, but with precious little impact. This is very alienating to families, it's very costly, and it's largely ineffective. I was in Alice Springs earlier this year, and Aboriginal people working in the town camps told me that the door is now shut, that families are sick to death of yet another person from another organisation knocking on the door, trying to help them with one problem. It has to be different from this. We have highly fragmented service systems. But we have come a long way. I'll come to the big pale blue concentric circle soon. But we have broadened the capacity and deepened the capacity of our universal services, not general practitioners, I would add in this respect, but certainly maternal and child health nurses, midwives, early childhood education and care, to be more aware of and to respond to vulnerable children and their families. And we now have a much better services, targeted services for vulnerable families. Initiatives like Communities for Children have strengthened that infrastructure. But still too often, to get the services that families need, families with multiple and complex need, they need to go through the highly stigmatising, humiliating and fear-inducing door of statutory child protection. And that's why I'm most concerned by the recommendation of last week of the Productivity Commission's draft report on childcare and early childhood learning in relation to the Commonwealth's childcare support for at-risk children. It's recommended that within the first week of a child experiencing childcare under that at-risk special early care and learning subsidy, that they be referred to the Statutory Child Protection Service in that state or territory. Now, someone has coaxed, encouraged and helped those fragile parents use a service for their child. And now, to extend that, they're going to have to be subjected to a risk assessment, which carries with it a fear of your child being removed. It might sound like a good bureaucratic rationing device, but this is extraordinarily traumatic for families to experience. We must not make families go through that door to get the services they require. But we need to go more than just reconfigure our children's services. We need to bring on board with us the services that deal with the parents' problems that cause the children's pain. And here I've put some of those services in the concentric circle. Disability services, mostly intellectual disability, family violence, drug and alcohol, housing and homelessness, correctional services, mental health services. I could have had problem gambling, in which this Institute is now working. Veterans Affairs, in terms of ex-servicemen and women with post-traumatic stress disorder. I could have added refugee resettlement services. There are many adult specialist services that need to be able to bring into their thinking and service delivery the needs of children and whole families. But let's start with those. And the good news is that in every one of those sectors, we have isolated exemplars of adult specialist services broadening their focus so that they are inclusive of children and a whole family. And not just services, but we have examples of whole sectors. And I know we've got David Templeman with us, and as the CEO of the Alcohol and Other Drug Councils of Australia, David led that whole sector to be mindful of children and whole families. There is great goodwill, because many of the people who work in those sectors understand this issue only too well. They're seeing it intergenerationally. So the key implications then are that we need to broaden service provider roles so that they can offer relationship-based, evidence-informed, comprehensive and family-centred responses to a much broader range of needs in families. We need to provide the workforce development and secondary consultation to equip those service providers to do that. And we need to improve interagency collaboration and effective referrals where and only where multiple services are really required. This is a 3-level massive reform. We can't just do it through workforce development by trying to equip the service providers with the values, the knowledge and the skills, and note the values comes first, to work with vulnerable families. This can only be done in an organisational context with the culture, the climate and the leadership mandates that. Otherwise it will die as soon as that service provider ceases to work. That is, it needs to be embedded in the organisation. And it can only be embedded in the organisation when it exists within a policy context with the funding models which enable that and the performance indicators which enable a broad response to multiple and complex needs. It does need organisations which are committed to something more than their own survival, something bigger than themselves. And we have some really promising initiatives, which I will just touch on to give you an illustration. I'm not going to talk much about programs because part of the problem is the plethora of programs. But this one I think is worth mentioning. Parenting Under Pressure, developed by Paul Harnett and Sharon Dorr, clinical psychologists from Queensland. And it has all the ingredients: evidence-informed, family-centred, in the home, dealing with parental substance misuse, dealing with the parent-child relationship, and ensuring program fidelity. In the UK, this is now subject to a randomised controlled trial in 11 sites, and it's one of the few programs where it's had an RCT here in Australia. Services Connect, an initiative of Department of Human Services in this state, which is now using one key worker to work with families whose needs cut across the parts of that department around housing, around disability, around child welfare. Child Aware, funded by the Department of Social Services under the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, led by Families Australia and the Australian Centre for Child Protection, working in sites of high social disadvantage to bring together adult specialist services and children's services and build the capacity of all those services to think child, think family, building on what has previously done by the Australian Centre for Child Protection in 12 sites across Australia. It's a good start, but it's only reaching a tiny fraction of the vulnerable children and families in this nation. And last, Collective Impact, which Ross Hommel may speak a little more of this afternoon, is very much a US-based in its origin, but now in Australia in various sites, using strong collaborative approaches by key stakeholders to deal with deep and complex social problems using agreed measures to assess progress. And the emphasis there is on collaboration. What do we know about collaboration? For it to work, 3 things need to be in place. Michael White and Gail Winkworth's work being particularly helpful in this regard. There needs to be an authorising environment, authority to collaborate, what we may do. There needs to be shared values and vision, what we should do together. And then there needs to be organisational capacity, the capability of what we can do. And we need to understand what gets in the way of collaboration. In my own research, I found that there were 5 different possible sources of the bitter, acrimonious conflict which can occur in our service network. And some of that is structural. Some of that's about gatekeeping, under demand pressures, the interorganisational. But some of it goes right deep into the psyche of service providers who project and displace in the face of families where they feel anguish and helplessness in relation to changing the situation for that child. And they see other organisations as having a magic wand, which they rarely possess. Unless we diagnose these sources of interagency conflict, we will not be able to address them. But what we need to do goes way beyond reconfiguring our service system. These problems can't be solved solely by services. They need population-based measures that tackle the key social determinants of child and family well-being. And the common risk factors and the common protective factors cut across a range of problems, from low birth weight to school failure to child abuse and neglect to juvenile crime. What would it look like on a population basis to tackle some of these risk factors? I'm just using this as an illustration. One risk factor: parental alcohol misuse. This is old data now, brought together by Sharon Dorr, but it's an underestimate because it's based on what people tell you happens when you knock on their door and ask them. But it's likely that well over 13.2% of Australian children live in households with at least one adult who is regularly binge drinking. We know from South Australian research that 70% of children entering care have at least one parent with a drinking problem. And we know that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a major problem in Australia. And what does the evidence tell us we could do about this? Well, a lot. volumetric taxing, minimum pricing, restricted advertising, licensing reform. In some Aboriginal communities, we have evidence about the value of community-mandated alcohol controls. Do we have most of these? No. Why not? Because the liquor industry has deep pockets and great political power. So until we mobilise the community, we will not have this. We need this. Like big tobacco, big booze is destroying children. In terms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, irreversibly damaging their brains, leading to them being highly compromised in their parenting capacity because of poor impulse control and cognitive deficits. I'm now going to move on to the protective factors, where the evidence base is far slimmer. Would it be possible for us to tackle a protective factor, the greatest protective factor of all, the strength of a parent's attachment to a child? That's why most of us, without thinking, would lay down our lives for our children. In fact, many would do it for a child they don't even know. This is a powerful protective factor. Would it be possible, because one study suggests we might want to try, to use ultrasound consultation on a population-based level, which is now used on, just an added 5 to 6 minutes of an ultrasound consultation to help individualise the unborn child, which in this study has been shown to strengthen parental attachment post-birth? What would that look like if we added that psychosocial dimension to our antenatal care? What would it look like if we avoided threats to maternal and paternal attachment during pregnancy and after birth? What if we thought that our pre-birth notifications to child protection could possibly raise the level of cortisol in a pregnant woman's bloodstream that goes straight through to her unborn child? That the fear of the child being removed at birth, which occurs, and I'm not saying it shouldn't occur, but the fear of it occurring to a pregnant woman may inhibit her attachment to her unborn child. What if some of our practices currently actually help destroy the attachment to the unborn child? We have from one study in Queensland, breastfeeding as a protective factor in relation to physical abuse by mothers. We can't build a service system on one study. But what I'm trying to sketch is what would it happen if we took a public health approach to how we might address the risk factors and the protective factors at a population level. We won't do it by programs. But can we think about prevention in a way that goes beyond impacting on the parent, that the parent is mediating this? Is there anything that we might do on a population basis that might directly affect children's resilience? Can we go beyond talking about children as objects of concern in this dialogue? Well, there's research, long research, classic research, which has taught us, but we've ignored, the importance of required helpfulness in childhood resilience. We have a whole industry now around resilience-based practice, but rarely, I don't think I've ever heard people draw on the absolutely central part of required helpfulness in resilience. So Glenn Elder's classic work in the reanalysis of those wonderful longitudinal studies back in the 1920s in the US found that older children, adolescents, were not adversely affected by their families losing more than a third of their income. And Glenn Elder explained that in terms of the older children and adolescents acquiring roles which made them contributors in their family. And Elder's much later work on the Iowa farm crisis in the 1980s and 1990s found the same, that children who just did well compared with those who did not were contributors in their families. And of course, there's Werner and Smith's classic study, where they identified 3 factors relating to resilience, and some of those are due to the temperament of the child, some of those are due to having no separations from the primary caregiver in the first year of life and having a significant and enduring attachment to at least one adult. But the third one is an active engagement in acts of required helpfulness in middle childhood and adolescence. Emmy Werner's own words. Self-esteem and self-efficacy also grew when youngsters took on a responsibility commensurate with their ability. Why have we ignored that? because we as a society have reduced children to being consumers and clients. We've ceased to think of them as contributors. Think about your family 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago. Children were contributors to families as economic units. They weren't consumers of the family unit and clients of services. There are many unanswered questions, but I believe that understanding the role of required helpfulness, how it might relate to a sense of efficacy, an internal locus of control, a sense of belonging, is an untapped resource. These are some of our unanswered questions. We don't even know the extent of children's contribution to the well-being of others in their families and in their schools and in their communities. We don't know how gender, class and culture might shape that. We don't know how it changes as a transition into adolescence. We don't know the degree to which intrinsic or extrinsic rewards might shape and sustain such behaviour. We don't know how it works for children who are not pro-social. There's a lot we don't know. But I do know that in schools across this country, there are many wonderful exemplars of children doing things for others, doing things in their community and being valued for that. Some of the work my partner and I do in our local environment are with children who are working to save an endangered species, the helmeted honeyeater, the avian emblem of this state. That's what the children do. They plant trees, and they do a lot more than that. What if we did with AIFS, Alan, here's a new project for you. What if we were to do a national study with children as co-investigators on what children do that is contributing in their families, in their schools, in their communities, and children in every community were to present this to their parents, to their teachers, to communities? And what if the aggregate with children presenting it was presented to the Prime Minister in Parliament? And we could hear the vision of Australian children. These aren't the adults of tomorrow, these are the citizens of today. This is how we need to hear about them. Professor Michael Rutter, the eminent child psychiatrist, has said that it seems desirable that we foster personality development in such a way that our children are cooperative and pro-social, not because they feel they have to be so, but rather because they get pleasure from being so. I don't think duty is going to cut it. I'm not talking about a coercive national conscription of children into community service top down. It's not mutual obligation. I'm talking about something that's owned by the community that government, business and philanthropy might support. And it might be very modest. $10,000 grant to a school might enable someone on 1 day a week to help make those linkages between the community and the school. Well, I'm not sure if these boys are enjoying planting the trees, but these girls sure are. Adam Phillips, the British psychoanalyst, always very puzzling when Philip Adams interviews him, but Adam Phillips, the psychoanalyst, and the historian Barbara Taylor, in their beautiful little book called On Kindness, have said this: the child needs the adult and his wider society to help him keep faith with his kindness. That is, to help him discover and enjoy the pleasures of caring for others. The child who has failed in this regard is robbed of one of the greatest sources of human happiness. Are we robbing our children of one of the greatest sources of human happiness and possibly one of the greatest sources of resilience? I believe we are. And I believe it's never too early and it's never too late. And I want to finish sharing a true story of a young man I mentored who had been, it's his story to tell, not mine, so I'll say very little in the detail, but he'd had a horrific experience in state care, multiple placements. But somehow, because it was never too late, through the Create Foundation for young people leaving care, he was able to belong, he was able to think there was a future. And through a mentoring program that he and I entered, I would meet with him very frequently. We'd meet together over a meal in each other's places where we lived. And what was interesting was that he went on to do social work at a university, through a special entry scheme, getting BEAR passes in first year. By fourth year, first class honours, went on to gain entry to an elite state public service graduate program, now has done postgraduate work. Extraordinary history of educational disadvantage and great pain and harm inflicted upon him. But when we used to meet, we mostly talked not about him. He mostly wanted to talk about a young boy, he was 10 when we started to meet, a young boy that he was mentoring in residential care, a young boy who was very violent, who eventually ended up being cared for in an environment just on his own, a young man who's now in a juvenile justice system. And the young man I mentored, I'll call him Michael, continues 10 years later to still be in contact with that young boy, still offering a relationship. And I often thought, as I saw Michael blossom into this beautiful young man, I often thought, was it my mentoring of him that made the difference? I think it was his mentoring of the boy in which he could see himself, the boy that he was helping to heal, and in doing so, helping to heal himself. So what is our vision? What can we change? My vision is that we go beyond child rescue, we go beyond child welfare, we go beyond child protection, that we embrace a child well-being movement based on prevention, based on social justice, based on children's rights, including their right to participate as contributors. Can we achieve this? I believe we can. Thank you.